Declassified. June 14, 1944. 8 days after the Allied landings at Normandy, the morning mist clung to the hedgerows like ghostly fingers, carrying with it the acrid smell of cordite and the metallic tang of blood that had soaked into French soil. Private Tommy Kellerman crouched in a drainage ditch that ran alongside what had once been a peaceful apple orchard, his Springfield rifle clutched against his chest as machine gun fire chattered overhead in deadly bursts. The sound was rhythmic, methodical, like some hellish metronome counting down to death. 40 yards ahead, through the thick Norman hedgerow that the locals called bocage, German MG-42s had turned what should have been a simple advance into a nightmare that had already claimed 63 men from his battalion in less than 2 hours. The sun was climbing higher now, burning away the protective mist and exposing the scattered bodies of American soldiers who had tried and failed to break through the seemingly impenetrable green walls that crisscrossed this corner of France like a medieval maze. Tommy could feel the heat building on his back through his wool uniform, mixing sweat with the grime and mud that covered every inch of his skin. His helmet, too big for his narrow head despite the newspaper padding his mother had insisted he stuff inside before shipping out, kept sliding down over his eyes as he tried to peer through the tangle of branches and thorns that had become his prison. Behind him, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb was shouting orders over the radio, his voice cracking with the strain of watching his men die in what military strategists would later call one of the bloodiest stalemates of a European campaign. The 2nd Battalion of the 116th Infantry Regiment had been tasked with clearing this particular section of hedgerow country, a mission that on paper seemed straightforward enough. Push through the bocage, eliminate German resistance, and advance toward the strategic crossroads at Saint-Pierre-du-Mont, simple. Clean. Achievable within 24 hours according to the brass who had planned this operation from the safety of their command posts miles behind the lines. But nobody had adequately prepared them for the reality of fighting in hedgerow country, where centuries-old earthen embankments topped with impenetrable thickets of hawthorn, blackberry, and oak created natural fortifications that would have made medieval castle builders weep with envy. The Germans had been here for 4 years, turning every gap, every field entrance, every thin spot in the vegetation into a carefully constructed killing zone. They knew exactly where the Americans would have to come through, and they were waiting with interlocking fields of fire that could cut down an entire squad in seconds. Tommy pressed his face against the cool earth, feeling the vibrations of approaching tank treads through the ground. Somewhere on the other side of the hedgerow, he could hear German voices calling to each other in sharp, clipped syllables that sounded like orders being barked back and forth. How many were there? The intelligence reports had suggested light resistance, perhaps a single understrength company holding defensive positions before falling back to secondary lines. Those reports, Tommy was beginning to realize, had been catastrophically wrong. The hedgerow in front of him stood 12 feet high, a wall of living green that had grown thick and wild over centuries of Norman agriculture. At its base, massive earthen embankments rose 4 feet from the ground, created by generations of farmers who had piled stones and dirt as they cleared their fields. On top of these ancient foundations, the vegetation had grown so dense that sunlight barely penetrated to ground level even at midday. It was like trying to assault a fortress made of thorns and shadows, defended by an enemy who could see everything while remaining completely invisible. Webb's voice crackled over the radio again, reporting to regimental headquarters with the kind of controlled desperation that comes from watching months of training and preparation crumble in the face of tactical reality. We've tried flanking movements on both sides. The entire sector is locked down tight. Every approach is covered by at least 2 machine gun positions with overlapping fields of fire. We need heavy artillery support, or armor, or something more than what we've got because what we're doing isn't working. The response from headquarters was predictable and infuriating in equal measure. Hold position. Await further orders. Continue to probe for weaknesses. But Tommy Kellerman, 19 years old and 6 months removed from helping his father harvest corn on their farm outside Abilene, Kansas, had been watching and listening and thinking. While other soldiers cursed the hedgerows as unnatural obstacles designed by Satan himself to torment American infantry, Tommy saw something different. He saw the same kind of problem he'd faced countless times back home when trying to move cattle from one pasture to another, or when needing to repair fence line that ran through thick brush where you couldn't get a truck or even a horse. He saw a puzzle that could be solved not with brute force, but with the kind of simple, practical ingenuity that farm boys learned by necessity before they were old enough to drive. The idea had been percolating in his mind for the past hour, ever since he'd noticed the way the hedgerow swayed slightly in the morning breeze despite its apparent solidity. There was something about the movement, about the way certain sections seemed to give more than others, that reminded him of something from back home. Something about rope and leverage and the basic physics his high school teacher had tried to drill into students who were more interested in getting home to help with chores than learning about mechanical advantage and fulcrum points. As machine gun fire erupted again from multiple positions along the hedgerow, sending leaves and bark fragments raining down on the pinned American soldiers, Tommy began to formulate a plan that would either get him killed or change everything. He had no way of knowing that his stupid rope trick, as he would later call it with characteristic Midwestern modesty, would not only save the lives of every man in his battalion but would also revolutionize the way American forces fought in hedgerow country for the remainder of the Normandy campaign. The sound of approaching German reinforcements grew louder, the distinctive rumble of panzer engines mixing with the steady chatter of small arms fire. Time was running out for the 2nd Battalion, and everyone knew it. In 3 hours, either they would find a way through these green walls, or they would be overrun by a German counterattack that would push Allied forces back toward the beaches they had fought so hard to establish just over a week before. The fate of the entire Normandy beachhead might well depend on what happened in this nameless apple orchard over the next few hours, and nobody had any idea that the solution would come from a skinny farm boy who still carried a length of rope in his pack because his father had taught him that a man never knew when he might need it. The global war had reached a critical juncture by the summer of 1944, with Allied forces finally established on European soil after years of fighting that had consumed entire nations and claimed millions of lives. The successful D-Day landings on June 6 had been just the beginning of what military planners knew would be a long and bloody campaign to liberate Western Europe from Nazi occupation. From the beaches of Normandy to the industrial heart of Germany lay hundreds of miles of territory that had been fortified and defended by an enemy who understood that every mile given up brought Allied armies closer to Berlin and the ultimate collapse of the Third Reich. Tommy Kellerman had never intended to become a soldier, much less find himself crouched in a Norman ditch with German machine guns trying to kill him. Born and raised on a wheat and cattle farm outside Abilene, Kansas, he had spent his first 18 years learning the rhythms of agricultural life, the kind of existence that revolved around seasons and weather and the endless cycle of planting and harvesting that had sustained his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had homesteaded the original 160 acres in 1889, building the first sod house with his own hands and gradually expanding the operation until it could support a wife and children through the boom and bust cycles that defined farming life on the Great Plains. Tommy's father, Earl Kellerman, had inherited both the land and the pragmatic approach to problem solving that made the difference between success and failure in an occupation where nature held most of the cards. Earl was the kind of man who could look at a broken piece of machinery and figure out how to fix it with whatever materials happened to be available, who could calculate the optimal time for harvesting wheat by reading subtle changes in wind patterns and the color of grain heads, who could move a stubborn bull from one pasture to another using nothing more than patience, psychology, and a well-placed rope. It was from his father that Tommy learned the fundamental truth that would later save his life and the lives of his fellow soldiers, that every problem, no matter how complex it appeared on the surface, could usually be solved by understanding the basic forces at work and finding a way to use those forces to your advantage rather than fighting against them. Whether it was convincing a horse to cross a stream, extracting a tractor from a muddy field, or persuading a bank loan officer that this year's crop would be better than last year's, success usually came down to leverage, timing, and the kind of creative thinking that city folks often dismissed as country ingenuity. The decision to enlist had not come easily for Tommy or his family. The Kellermans were not a military family by tradition, and the farm needed all the help it could get, especially with commodity prices still recovering from the Depression years. But by late 1943, as news from the European and Pacific theaters grew more urgent and the draft boards began calling up young men from rural communities that had already given more than their share, Tommy knew that his number would soon be called regardless of agricultural deferments. Better to volunteer on his own terms than wait to be drafted, he reasoned, and better to get the choice of service branch rather than being assigned wherever the military happened to need bodies. Basic training at Fort Riley, Kansas, had been both easier and harder than Tommy had expected. The physical demands were manageable for someone who had spent his life throwing hay bales, wrestling cattle, and working 16-hour days during harvest season. His marksmanship scores were among the highest in his company, thanks to years of hunting rabbits and coyotes with his father's old Winchester. But the military's emphasis on following orders without question, on doing things by the book even when the book seemed to contradict common sense, chafed against every instinct he had developed growing up in a world where individual initiative and creative problem-solving were matters of survival. The low point had come during an exercise in small unit tactics, when Tommy had been assigned to lead a squad in an assault on a mock enemy position. Instead of following the prescribed frontal attack that was outlined in the training manual, Tommy had studied the terrain and devised what he thought was a more practical approach, using a dry creek bed to move his squad into position for a flanking maneuver that would minimize casualties while achieving the same objective. His plan worked perfectly, with his squad capturing the position while suffering no losses and surprising the instructors with their tactical creativity. But instead of praise, Tommy had found himself facing a furious drill sergeant who berated him for 20 minutes about the importance of following orders, maintaining unit cohesion, and trusting in proven military doctrine rather than freelancing in combat situations. "This isn't your daddy's farm, Kellerman," Sergeant Morrison had shouted, his face inches from Tommy's nose. "In combat, soldiers who think they know better than their training manual get other soldiers killed. You want to be creative? Join the Army Corps of Engineers after the war. Right now, I need soldiers who can follow orders and execute standard procedures without improvising." The incident had nearly resulted in Tommy washing out of infantry training, transferred to some support role where his tendency toward independent thinking would be less likely to get anyone killed. It was only the intervention of Lieutenant Paul Hendricks, a young officer from Ohio who had been observing the exercise, that saved Tommy's military career. Hendricks had pulled Tommy aside after the official reprimand and explained that while following orders was indeed crucial for military effectiveness, there would also be situations in combat where rigid adherence to doctrine could be just as dangerous as reckless improvisation. "The trick," Hendricks had explained, "is learning when to follow the book and when to throw it away. That comes with experience, and it comes with understanding not just what you're supposed to do, but why you're supposed to do it. The best soldiers are the ones who understand the principles behind the procedures, so they know when the procedures need to be adapted to fit circumstances the manual writers never anticipated." He had arranged for Tommy to receive additional training in small unit leadership and had personally recommended him for assignment to a frontline infantry unit where his particular combination of tactical thinking and practical skills might prove valuable. The troopship journey to England had been Tommy's first time away from Kansas, his first time seeing the ocean, his first real glimpse of a world that extended far beyond the horizons of wheat fields and cattle pastures that had defined his entire existence up to that point. Standing on deck as the Statue of Liberty disappeared behind them and the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly ahead, Tommy had tried to imagine what awaited him in Europe, what it would be like to face an enemy who wanted to kill him, how he would react the first time he had to point his rifle at another human being and pull the trigger. The staging camps in England had been a revelation of military bureaucracy and organized chaos, thousands of young men from every corner of America thrown together in preparation for what everyone knew would be the largest and most important military operation in human history. Tommy had been assigned to the 2nd Battalion of the 116th Infantry Regiment, part of the 29th Infantry Division, a unit with a proud history dating back to the First World War but now filled largely with draftees and volunteers who had never seen combat. His first real taste of war had come during the D-Day landings, when his landing craft had grounded on Omaha Beach in the second wave of the assault. The experience had been nothing like the training exercises, nothing like the war movies he had watched growing up. The noise was overwhelming, a constant barrage of artillery and machine gun fire and shouting voices that made it impossible to think clearly or follow the carefully rehearsed plans that had seemed so logical back in England. Men were dying all around him, some calling for their mothers, others cursing in languages he didn't recognize, most simply trying to find some small piece of cover where they might survive the next few minutes. But somehow, Tommy had not only survived the beach assault but had distinguished himself by organizing a group of scattered soldiers from different units into an effective fighting force that cleared several German strongpoints and opened a path inland for follow-on forces. His combination of tactical sense, calm under pressure, and ability to communicate clearly with men who were terrified and confused had caught the attention of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, the battalion commander who would later give Tommy the freedom to attempt his revolutionary solution to the hedgerow problem. Now, 8 days after the landings, Tommy found himself facing a different kind of challenge than the open carnage of the beach assault. The hedgerows of Normandy represented a type of warfare that American forces had never encountered before, a three-dimensional puzzle of fortified agricultural terrain that turned every field into a potential killing ground and every advance into a costly gamble against an enemy who held every advantage except numbers. The question was whether the lessons Tommy had learned growing up on a Kansas farm, combined with the military training he had received over the past year, would be enough to find a solution that had eluded some of the most experienced combat officers in the American Army. The hedgerow problem had been frustrating American commanders since the first units pushed inland from the landing beaches and encountered the bocage country that dominated this region of Normandy. Intelligence reports had mentioned the hedgerows in passing, describing them as agricultural boundaries that might provide some obstacles to armored movement but would not significantly impede infantry operations. This assessment had proven to be one of the most dangerous miscalculations of the entire Normandy campaign, as Allied forces quickly discovered that the hedgerows were not simple fence lines but rather centuries-old fortifications that made medieval castle walls look easy to breach. Each hedgerow represented the accumulated labor of countless generations of Norman farmers who had cleared stones from their fields and piled them along property boundaries, creating earthen embankments that over time had been colonized by the most aggressive and thorny vegetation that northern France could produce. Hawthorn trees with branches like sharpened spears, blackberry canes that could tear through clothing and flesh with equal ease, oak saplings so tightly interwoven that they formed an almost solid wall of wood and thorns. On top of these natural defenses, the Germans had spent 4 years of occupation adding their own improvements, carefully sited machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire, mortar positions that could drop shells with surgical precision into any gap where Allied forces might attempt to break through, and observation posts that provided perfect visibility across the small fields that were enclosed by each section of hedgerow. The tactical situation was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. German forces could move freely along the base of the hedgerows, using centuries-old farm paths that were invisible to Allied observers but provided protected routes for repositioning weapons and reinforcements. Every field became a separate battlefield, with no way for attacking forces to provide mutual support once they were committed to an assault. Artillery was largely ineffective because the earthen embankments absorbed most of the blast effects, and even direct hits on the hedgerows themselves did little more than scatter leaves and small branches while leaving the underlying structure intact. American forces had attempted every conventional solution in their tactical playbook. Frontal assaults resulted in catastrophic casualties as soldiers tried to climb over or through obstacles that channeled them into carefully prepared killing zones. Flanking movements were impossible because the hedgerows extended for miles in every direction, creating a maze with no open flanks to exploit. Heavy weapons were largely useless because targets were invisible until soldiers were close enough to be killed by small arms fire, and even successful hits on German positions accomplished little because the enemy could simply relocate to another prepared position 50 yards away. Tank support, which had been so effective in the more open country around the landing beaches, proved almost worse than useless in hedgerow terrain. The narrow farm lanes that connected fields could barely accommodate a Sherman tank, and any armor that ventured into these confined spaces became a sitting duck for German anti-tank weapons. Even when tanks managed to position themselves for fire support, they could rarely identify targets through the thick vegetation, and their main guns were too powerful for precise work at close range. More than one American assault had been disrupted by friendly fire incidents when tank crews, unable to see clearly through the undergrowth, had fired on their own infantry. Tommy had been observing these failed attempts for a week now, watching good soldiers die in attacks that everyone knew were doomed before they started but which had to be attempted anyway because there seemed to be no alternative. The military doctrine that had been drilled into him during training emphasized the importance of concentrated firepower, combined arms tactics, and overwhelming force applied at the point of decision. But none of these principles seemed to apply in a situation where the enemy was essentially invisible, where firepower was largely ineffective against earthen fortifications, and where force had to be applied through narrow openings that negated every numerical advantage the Americans possessed. It was during one of these costly and futile attacks that Tommy first noticed something that would prove to be the key to solving the hedgerow puzzle. As he watched a squad from Baker Company attempt to break through a particularly thick section of bocage, he saw how the entire hedgerow swayed slightly when the soldiers grabbed branches and tried to pull themselves up the embankment. The movement was subtle, barely perceptible unless you were looking for it, but it suggested that despite their appearance of solid permanence, the hedgerows had structural characteristics that might be exploited by someone who understood the basic principles of leverage and mechanical advantage. Growing up on the farm, Tommy had learned to move heavy objects by understanding their balance points and applying force in ways that multiplied his physical strength. Loading hay bales onto a truck, for instance, required not just muscle but technique, using the momentum of the bale and the leverage of the hay fork to accomplish what would be impossible through brute force alone. Similarly, when a cow got stuck in a fence or a tractor bogged down in soft ground, the solution usually involved finding the right angle and the right application of force rather than simply pushing harder in the same direction that hadn't worked the first time. The more Tommy studied the hedgerows, the more he became convinced that they were not the impregnable obstacles they appeared to be, but rather structures that could be defeated by understanding and exploiting their fundamental characteristics. The thick vegetation that made them so difficult to penetrate also made them top-heavy, with most of their mass concentrated well above their center of gravity. The ancient earthen embankments provided a solid foundation, but they also created a fulcrum point that might be used to advantage by someone who understood basic physics and had access to the right tools. The idea that would revolutionize hedgerow warfare began to take shape in Tommy's mind during the long hours of waiting between attacks, when he had time to think through the problem methodically rather than simply react to immediate tactical situations. He remembered helping his father remove a large oak tree that had been struck by lightning, using ropes and pulleys to control the direction of its fall and prevent it from damaging nearby buildings. The principle was simple enough: apply force at the right point and in the right direction, and even a massive object could be moved with relatively little effort. But when Tommy finally worked up the courage to share his idea with Lieutenant Colonel Webb, the reaction was less than enthusiastic. Webb listened politely as Tommy explained his theory about using ropes and leverage to collapse sections of hedgerow, but the colonel's expression grew more skeptical with each word. "Private Kellerman," Webb finally said, "I appreciate your initiative, and God knows we need new ideas. But we're talking about structures that have been growing here for centuries. These aren't corn stalks that you can push over with a tractor. The engineers have already looked at the problem from every angle, and if there was a simple solution, don't you think they would have found it by now?" The engineering assessment had indeed been thorough and discouraging. Captain Robert Mitchell, the battalion's senior engineer officer, had spent 3 days studying the hedgerow construction and concluded that any attempt to breach them would require either massive amounts of high explosives, which were in short supply and would alert German forces to American intentions, or specialized equipment that would take weeks to requisition and transport from England. The basic problem, Mitchell had explained in his written report, is that these structures combine the worst aspects of natural and artificial obstacles. The vegetation is too thick and resilient to be cut quickly by hand tools, too intertwined to be pulled apart by individual soldiers, and too well-rooted to be pushed over by available mechanical equipment. The earthen embankments underneath are too solid to be dug through quickly and too high to be climbed under fire. Any solution will require either overwhelming firepower, which we don't have, or specialized breaching equipment, which we also don't have. But Tommy's farm background had taught him to question expert opinions, especially when those opinions seemed to ignore obvious possibilities. He had seen too many situations where college-educated agricultural extension agents had declared certain problems impossible to solve, only to watch his father or other experienced farmers find practical solutions that worked perfectly well even if they couldn't be explained in textbooks. The key was usually to stop thinking about what couldn't be done and start focusing on what could be done with the materials and knowledge actually available. Tommy's plan was deceptively simple in concept but would require precise execution and perfect timing to work in combat conditions. Instead of trying to break through the hedgerows or climb over them, he proposed to pull them down using the basic principles of leverage and mechanical advantage that any farmer would understand instinctively. The thick vegetation that made the hedgerows so difficult to penetrate also made them vulnerable to being toppled if the right force was applied at the right point. Like a tree being felled, a section of hedgerow could be brought down in a controlled manner that would create a gap wide enough for infantry to pass through while providing some protection from German observation and fire. The technical details of Tommy's innovation would prove to be both elegant and practical, requiring only materials that were readily available to any infantry unit and skills that could be learned by soldiers with minimal technical training. But the real genius of his approach lay not in its complexity but in its simplicity, the recognition that sometimes the most effective solutions were also the most obvious ones, hidden in plain sight from experts who were looking for sophisticated answers to what was fundamentally a basic problem in applied physics and farm mechanics. Tommy's breakthrough came from recognizing that the hedgerows, despite their appearance of ancient permanence, were actually dynamic structures that could be manipulated by someone who understood their underlying characteristics and vulnerabilities. The centuries of growth that made them so formidable also created weaknesses that could be exploited by the right combination of technique, timing, and tools that every farm boy carried as naturally as a soldier carried ammunition. What remained was to convince his superiors to let him try an approach that violated every conventional military doctrine about obstacle reduction but might just save the lives of every man in the battalion. The innovation that Tommy Kellerman developed would later be analyzed by military engineers and incorporated into official field manuals, but its origins lay in the kind of practical problem-solving that farmers had been using for generations to move heavy objects with minimal equipment and maximum efficiency. The basic concept involved creating what engineers would later term a controlled structural failure in the hedgerow system, using the natural characteristics of the vegetation and embankment to achieve results that would have been impossible through conventional military engineering approaches. The first component of Tommy's system was the rope itself, 50 feet of 3/4-inch hemp line that he had carried in his pack since leaving Kansas because his father had taught him that a man never knew when he might need to secure, move, or lift something heavier than he could handle alone. This was not military-issue equipment but rather the kind of general-purpose rope that every farm kept on hand for 1,000 different tasks, from towing stuck vehicles to restraining livestock to rigging temporary repairs on equipment that couldn't wait for professional maintenance. The key insight that separated Tommy's approach from previous failed attempts lay in his understanding of where and how to apply force to achieve maximum effect with minimum effort. Instead of trying to pull the hedgerow straight back from its face, which would require overcoming the full structural strength of centuries-old root systems and earthen foundations, Tommy proposed to create a fulcrum point that would use the hedgerow's own mass and height against itself. By positioning the rope at approximately 2/3 of the hedgerow's height and pulling at an angle that was perpendicular to the natural growth pattern, he could induce a rotational force that would cause the entire structure to topple in a controlled manner. The second critical element was the method of attachment, which required understanding both the structural characteristics of hedgerow vegetation and the dynamics of force transmission through natural materials. Tommy had observed that while the individual plants that made up a hedgerow grew independently, they had become so intertwined over decades of growth that they functioned as a single structural unit. The hawthorn trees that formed the backbone of most hedgerows had branches that interlocked with neighboring trees, creating a natural truss system that distributed loads across multiple stems. By looping his rope around several of these main structural elements and using a series of half-hitches to distribute the pulling force, Tommy could effectively harness the strength of the entire hedgerow section rather than relying on the holding power of any individual tree or branch. The physics involved were straightforward applications of principles that any high school student should have understood, but which had apparently been overlooked by military engineers who were trained to think in terms of explosive demolition and mechanical excavation rather than agricultural mechanics. The hedgerow's center of gravity was located approximately 8 feet above ground level, well above the midpoint of its total height due to the concentration of heavy vegetation in the upper canopy. This created a naturally unstable configuration that was held in place primarily by the extensive root system and the mutual support provided by neighboring vegetation. By applying lateral force at a point above the center of gravity and at an angle that would cause the hedgerow to rotate around its base rather than simply bend, Tommy could initiate a failure mode that would cause the entire structure to collapse in a predictable direction. The key was to start the rotation slowly, allowing the weight of the upper vegetation to build momentum as it began to fall, until the process became self-sustaining and the hedgerow would complete its collapse under its own weight even if the applied force was removed. The third component of the system involved the tactical application of this technique under combat conditions, which required not just understanding the physics but also timing the operation to take maximum advantage of the confusion and disruption it would create among defending German forces. Tommy had observed that German defensive tactics relied heavily on maintaining clear fields of fire through predetermined gaps in the hedgerow system, with machine gun positions carefully sited to cover these openings with interlocking fire. By creating a new gap in an unexpected location, American forces could potentially achieve tactical surprise and penetrate German lines before defensive positions could be repositioned to cover the breach. The materials required for Tommy's system were remarkably simple and could be improvised from supplies that any infantry unit would normally carry. In addition to the rope, he needed only a few items that could be scavenged from the immediate area: several sturdy wooden stakes that could be cut from hedgerow branches or salvaged from damaged farm buildings, a small pulley or even a carabiner to redirect the rope and multiply the applied force, and most importantly, a solid anchor point that could withstand the substantial loads that would be generated during the pulling operation. This last requirement proved to be the most challenging aspect of the system to solve under battlefield conditions, since the obvious anchor points such as large trees or buildings were either unavailable in the immediate vicinity of most hedgerows or were themselves under German observation and fire. Tommy's solution was characteristically practical and farm-oriented. Instead of looking for a single massive anchor point, he would distribute the load across multiple smaller anchors using a technique that riggers and farmers had employed for generations when moving heavy equipment. By driving several wooden stakes into the ground at angles that would direct the applied forces into the earth rather than trying to pull the stakes out of the ground, and connecting these stakes with additional rope in a configuration that engineers call a deadman anchor system, Tommy could create an anchor point capable of withstanding several tons of pulling force using nothing more than materials that could be gathered from the immediate area. The system was entirely scalable, meaning that additional stakes could be added if the loads proved greater than expected, and the entire apparatus could be constructed in less than 15 minutes by soldiers with minimal training in rope work and basic engineering principles. The testing phase of Tommy's innovation took place during the pre-dawn hours of June 14, when German activity was typically at its lowest ebb and American forces had maximum opportunity to conduct experiments without drawing immediate enemy fire. Tommy had convinced Lieutenant Colonel Webb to allow him to attempt a proof-of-concept demonstration on a section of hedgerow that was not directly under German observation, using volunteers from his own squad who were willing to risk their lives on what most of the battalion still considered a desperate and probably suicidal experiment. The first test revealed several problems with Tommy's initial approach, primarily related to the difficulty of getting the rope properly positioned while under the stress of combat conditions and the tendency of the hemp line to stretch under load in ways that reduced the efficiency of force transmission. These issues required immediate modifications to the basic technique, including the development of a more secure attachment method that could be implemented quickly by soldiers wearing full combat gear, and adjustments to the pulling angle that would account for rope stretch and maintain optimal force vectors throughout the collapse sequence. The second test, conducted just before dawn with German patrols known to be active in the immediate area, demonstrated that the basic concept was sound but needed refinement in its execution. The hedgerow section that Tommy targeted did indeed collapse in approximately the manner he had predicted, creating a gap roughly 15 feet wide and providing access to the field beyond. However, the collapse was noisier than anticipated, with the sound of breaking branches and falling vegetation clearly audible to German positions several hundred yards away, and the gap that was created was partially obstructed by the fallen vegetation in ways that would slow the movement of attacking infantry. These problems were solvable through minor modifications to the technique, but they highlighted the importance of perfect execution when the system was finally employed under actual combat conditions. There would be no opportunity for second chances or do-overs when German machine gunners were shooting at American soldiers who were trying to move through the gap that Tommy's innovation had created. Every aspect of the operation would need to be rehearsed until it could be performed instinctively, even under the extreme stress and confusion of infantry combat. The final test took place during the early morning hours of June 14, with Tommy and his volunteers positioned less than 100 yards from known German defensive positions and working under conditions that were as close to actual combat as possible without drawing enemy fire that would compromise the entire operation. This test validated both the technical aspects of the system and its practical application under battlefield conditions, demonstrating that a properly trained team could breach a hedgerow section in less than 10 minutes from start to finish and create a gap that would allow an entire squad to pass through in tactical formation. More importantly, the final test revealed that Tommy's innovation had effects beyond simply creating physical gaps in German defensive lines. The psychological impact of seeing sections of hedgerow collapse without warning was potentially as valuable as the tactical advantage of new infiltration routes, since it would force German defenders to question the security of positions they had considered impregnable and potentially cause them to redeploy forces to cover threats that had not previously existed. In warfare, uncertainty and confusion among enemy forces were often more valuable than raw firepower, and Tommy's rope trick had the potential to create both in abundance. The technical validation of his system gave Tommy confidence that his innovation could work under combat conditions, but he knew that the real test would come when German machine gunners were shooting at American soldiers who were depending on his technique to save their lives. Everything he had learned about hedgerow construction, rope work, and applied physics would need to function perfectly under the most stressful conditions imaginable, with the lives of his fellow soldiers hanging in the balance and no margin for error or equipment failure. June 14, 1944, 0347 hours. The pre-dawn darkness hung over the Norman countryside like a shroud, broken only by the occasional flare that cast dancing shadows across the checkerboard of fields and hedgerows that had become a killing ground for American forces trying to advance inland from the D-Day beaches. Tommy Kellerman lay flat against the base of a hedgerow that his squad had been ordered to breach at first light, listening to the sounds that would soon determine whether his innovation would save lives or merely add his name to the casualty lists that were growing longer with each failed assault. The German positions were closer than intelligence reports had indicated, close enough that Tommy could hear individual voices speaking in the clipped, efficient tones that suggested professional soldiers making final preparations for combat. Somewhere beyond the wall of vegetation that loomed above him in the darkness, machine gunners were checking their weapons, adjusting their fields of fire, and probably discussing the best techniques for killing the American soldiers they knew would soon attempt another futile assault against positions that had already proven impregnable to conventional infantry tactics. Lieutenant Colonel Webb had positioned himself in a shell crater 20 yards behind Tommy's position, close enough to observe the operation but far enough back to maintain command and control if the breach attempt failed and required immediate tactical adjustments. The colonel's radio operator was monitoring communications with regimental headquarters, ready to call for artillery support or medical evacuation depending on how the next few minutes developed. Webb had made it clear to Tommy that this would be the battalion's last attempt to break through this particular section of German lines. If the rope trick failed, they would have to fall back and wait for heavy equipment or massive artillery preparation that might not be available for several days. The stakes could not have been higher. German reconnaissance had identified the American positions during the night, and radio intercepts suggested that a counterattack was being prepared that would hit the exposed battalion sometime during the morning hours. If American forces could not advance through the hedgerows and establish defensive positions in the next field, they would be caught in the open when German armor and infantry launched their assault. The choice was simple: break through now or face annihilation in a few hours when German forces seized the initiative and attacked American positions that had no natural cover or concealment. Tommy's hands were steady as he made final adjustments to the rope system he had spent the previous week perfecting through trial and error that had nearly cost him his life on several occasions. The hemp line was coiled at his feet in a pattern that would allow it to deploy smoothly without tangling, even in the darkness and under the stress of combat conditions. His anchor system was already in place, 5 wooden stakes driven deep into the earth at carefully calculated angles that would distribute the anticipated load safely into the ground rather than simply pulling the anchors out of their holes when maximum force was applied. The attachment point he had selected was a cluster of mature hawthorn trees approximately 10 feet above ground level, where the main structural elements of the hedgerow were most tightly interwoven and would provide the most effective force transmission to the entire section he intended to collapse. Getting the rope into position had required exposing himself to potential German observation for nearly 3 minutes, long enough for enemy snipers to identify and engage him if they had been paying attention to this particular section of their defensive line. But Tommy had chosen his moment carefully, waiting for a period when German flare activity was at its lowest ebb and when the prevailing wind would carry any sounds he made away from enemy listening posts rather than toward them. His movements had been deliberate and controlled, using techniques he had learned as a teenager when hunting deer that required approaching within close range without alerting prey that could detect the slightest unnatural sound or movement. The skills that had made him successful at putting meat on his family's table were now being applied to the considerably more complex task of staying alive while preparing to kill other human beings. The countdown to each hour proceeded with mechanical precision, each minute marked by whispered reports from squad leaders positioned along the line of departure that would soon become the axis of advance for an assault that would either break the deadlock in hedgerow country or add another chapter to the growing catalogue of failed American attacks. Tommy's squad had been reinforced with additional riflemen and a light machine gun team, bringing their total strength to 14 men who would have less than 60 seconds to exploit whatever gap his rope trick might create in German defensive lines. Artillery preparation was minimal, just enough high explosive and white phosphorus to convince German defenders that this was another conventional assault rather than something fundamentally different that might require new defensive tactics. The barrage would lift at exactly 0400 hours, giving Tommy and his team a narrow window of opportunity to collapse their section of hedgerow and begin moving through the gap before German machine gunners could reorient their weapons to cover the new breach in their defensive line. At 0359 hours, Tommy began applying tension to his rope system, using a technique he had learned from his father for moving fallen trees that were too heavy to lift but could be rolled or pulled with the right application of leverage and patience. The initial resistance was substantial, as centuries of growth had created root systems and interlocking branches that were designed by nature to resist exactly the kind of forces he was now applying. But Tommy had calculated these loads carefully during his testing phase, and he knew that once the initial static friction was overcome, the collapse would proceed under its own momentum as the weight of the upper vegetation created rotational forces that would complete the job he had started. The first sign of success came as a subtle change in the tension of the rope, a slight yielding that indicated structural elements within the hedgerow were beginning to fail under the sustained lateral pressure. Tommy increased the applied force gradually, using his body weight and a series of mechanical advantages to multiply his physical strength until he was exerting several times what any individual soldier could produce through simple muscle power alone. The anchor system held perfectly, distributing the loads exactly as he had designed it to do during his testing phase. At 0400 hours exactly, American artillery fire ceased and the hedgerow began its collapse in a cascade of breaking branches, tearing roots, and falling vegetation that created exactly the kind of gap Tommy had envisioned during his weeks of planning and preparation. The sound was tremendous, like a forest being clear-cut by a giant invisible saw, but it was also brief, lasting less than 30 seconds before the dust and debris settled to reveal a passage through what had been an impenetrable obstacle just moments before. German reaction was immediate and predictable, with machine gun fire sweeping across the area where the hedgerow had stood, but the gunners were shooting at predetermined coordinates that no longer corresponded to reality on the ground. The collapse had created not just a physical gap in their defensive line but also a gap in their understanding of the tactical situation, forcing them to improvise responses to a threat that had not existed in their pre-planned defensive fires. Confusion and uncertainty, exactly the effects that Tommy had hoped to achieve through his innovation. The American assault through the gap proceeded with textbook precision, with lead elements moving through the breach while supporting fire kept German defenders suppressed and prevented them from repositioning weapons to cover the new avenue of approach. Tommy's squad established a foothold in the next field within 90 seconds of the hedgerow collapse, and follow-on forces were able to exploit the penetration before German reserves could arrive to seal the breach that conventional military wisdom had declared impossible to create. The immediate tactical results exceeded everyone's expectations, but the strategic implications would prove even more significant as word of Tommy's innovation spread throughout American forces in Normandy and fundamentally changed the way hedgerow warfare was conducted for the remainder of the campaign. Within 24 hours, rope teams were being organized in every infantry unit operating in Bocage country, and within a week, specialized equipment and training programs were being developed to institutionalize techniques that a farm boy from Kansas had invented out of necessity and applied with the kind of practical ingenuity that military academies rarely teach but which often makes the difference between victory and defeat in actual combat. The immediate recognition of Tommy Kellerman's achievement came not through formal military channels, which would take weeks to process and validate his innovation, but through the direct testimony of soldiers whose lives had been saved by his rope trick and commanders who had witnessed its effectiveness under conditions where conventional tactics had repeatedly failed. Lieutenant Colonel Webb's after-action report described the hedgerow breach as a revolutionary development in infantry tactics and recommended both immediate recognition for Private Kellerman and urgent dissemination of his techniques to other units facing similar tactical challenges. Within hours of the successful assault, Tommy found himself surrounded by officers from regimental and division headquarters who wanted detailed explanations of his methodology and immediate demonstrations of how the rope system could be replicated by other units. The attention was overwhelming for a 19-year-old farm boy who had never considered himself particularly innovative or intelligent, just practical in the way that rural life demanded of anyone who expected to survive and prosper in an environment where theoretical knowledge mattered less than the ability to solve real problems with available resources. The Bronze Star Medal that Tommy received 2 weeks later was accompanied by a field promotion to corporal and assignment to a newly created position as the battalion specialist in obstacle reduction and improvised engineering solutions. His official job description was vague enough to allow him considerable latitude in developing new techniques for problems that conventional military doctrine had not anticipated, but specific enough to ensure that his innovations would be properly documented and disseminated to units that could benefit from his particular combination of farm-bred ingenuity and combat-tested effectiveness. But perhaps more meaningful to Tommy than any official recognition was the knowledge that his rope trick had been adopted by American forces throughout the European theater and had contributed to saving thousands of lives during the hedgerow fighting that continued throughout the summer of 1944. Engineering manuals were rewritten to include detailed instructions for what became known as the Kellerman method of obstacle reduction, and training programs were established at infantry schools to ensure that future soldiers would have access to techniques that previous generations of military professionals had never imagined. Tommy's post-war life reflected the same practical approach to problem-solving that had made him successful as a soldier, as he returned to Kansas and used his GI Bill benefits to study agricultural engineering at Kansas State University while continuing to help his father manage the family farm. The combination of formal education and practical experience made him one of the most sought-after agricultural consultants in the region, specializing in innovative solutions to problems that conventional approaches could not address effectively. His engineering consulting business, established in 1952, focused primarily on helping small family farms improve their efficiency through creative applications of basic mechanical principles, the same kind of thinking that had led to his breakthrough in hedgerow warfare. Tommy never advertised his military service or the recognition he had received, preferring to let his work speak for itself and maintaining the modest demeanor that his parents had instilled in him during his childhood on the Great Plains. The farm that Tommy eventually inherited from his father became a model of sustainable agriculture and mechanical innovation, attracting visitors from agricultural colleges and government agencies who wanted to study techniques that increased productivity while reducing environmental impact. His approach emphasized understanding and working